Thank you very much. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here, and I'm very honored to have received this award, and I'm looking forward to sharing what I've done so far on the research for this award with you all today. So my talk is based on the research on spirituality of Dutch painter Piet Mondrian, research that I've done so far for the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park Award. In my talk, first I will discuss a figurative and an abstract painting by Piet Mondrian that he respectively made in 1908 and 1918. These two paintings demonstrate Mondrian's transforming ideas about vision, painterly language, and its spiritual potential. Second, I will look at some of his writings. Mondrian was not only an avid painter, but also an avid writer, which shed further light on his intentions for his artworks. And in his notes and his texts, he attempted to get at the heart of the relationship between his radically abstract visual language, the modernizing world that he lived in, the first half of the 20th century, and a spiritually elevated state of mind, which he saw as an ideal to reach. And thirdly, in this talk, I will argue that in order to fully grasp the implications of this relationship, Mondrian integrated traditional and modern dynamics of vision in his pictorial and theoretical endeavors. He is often presented as an ultra-modern and ultra-innovative artist, but at the heart of these endeavors, there are actually some very pre-modern or traditional elements at play. So overall, I propose a shift in scholarly focus from Mondrian's visual language, which has been dominant in the art historical paradigm, towards a focus on, for the lack of a better term right now, worldview. In doing so, it's possible to get a firmer grip on the position of spirituality in his artistic practices. For Mondrian, spirituality is not a temporary engagement or a hobby on the side, as is often argued, but located at the heart of his work. The main scholarly controversy around his spirituality rests in the question whether Mondrian can be characterized as a theosophical artist with making his paintings theosophical artworks or not. Can we use that term? The disagreement that is still very strong today about this is no reason, as some scholars do, to dismiss his spirituality altogether. Which is, as I will argue, of fundamental importance in understanding his artistic practices, and even more so, his ideas on how the art should function in the world, and for the people looking at it. The proposed focus on vision reveals that Mondrian's spirituality was strongly related to modern urban life, so the picture that we all hold of him today, but it was also rooted in fundamentally pre-modern ideas on the universality of vision. In January 1909, Mondrian displayed this painting of a dazzlingly red and blue mill against a bright yellow lit sky in the Stedelijk Museum of Amsterdam. Together with two artist friends, Mondrian had rented several exhibition halls to display their brightly colored modern work. If they had not organized the exhibition themselves, no museum would have shown their work at that time. While in this particular painting, Mondrian intended to convey a particular experience of seeing the world, many of the critics interpreted this painting in a very literal way. The first thing you may notice about this painting is that it seems to be a precursor of Mondrian's later use of primary colors. But at the time of making, this was not yet an issue at all for him. While many post-impressionist and later expressionist painters used color and movement to convey emotional perceptions of a particular setting, for Mondrian, color and texture served the purpose of capturing modes of visual perception itself. So it's not the expression of a state of mind, but the visualization of a particular way of seeing. This red mill against the yellow sky conveys the experience of seeing against brightly shining sunlight, with a shimmering distant horizon. Mondrian translated this onto the canvas by a yellow web of uneven lines and holes. While for the painter, this experiment of representing vision in an artistic way meant a radical innovation, contemporary critics, almost unanimously, had no idea what to do with it. One even described the painting as a mill dripped in blood against a yellow sky with holes like Swiss cheese. The rather famous psychiatrist, utopian thinker, and author Frederik van Eeden, who had taken the 1909 exhibition as an opportunity to write an essay about the deterioration in the visual arts, had described the colorful work of Mondrian as a product of mental illness and spiritual decadence. In response to the only positive review of this 1909 exhibition, Mondrian wrote a letter in which he emphasized how, with his art, he wanted to express an intrinsic and universal truth. This notion of intrinsic truth and unchanging value is of crucial importance to understand Mondrian's later development towards abstraction. For Mondrian, the fact that he was searching for a new artistic style that coincided with the rapid development of modern times did not mean that the content of what he wanted to express was radically new. On the contrary, it was an inherent, fixed, and universal fundament he sought to channel through in his art. Mondrian connected this notion of universal values and truths directly to the realm of the spiritual, or, as he also used to call it, the occult. Around these years, he was thoroughly invested in the theosophical movement. He read many theosophical texts, described Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine as a true foundation for all things, and saw these types of texts as providing him with gateways to occult knowledge. Although Mondrian saw a direct relationship between the spiritual knowledge of an artist and the work that this artist produced, he was the first to acknowledge that the wider public was by no means particularly prepared to accept this. That is why, around 1909, he deliberately stuck to painting recognizable subjects. He wrote, quote, "For the present, at least, I shall restrict my work to the customary world of the senses, since that is the world in which we still live. But nevertheless, art already can provide a transition to the finer regions, which I call the spiritual realm." Unquote. 10 years later, Mondrian expressed his ideas in a very different way. In 1918, he produced this painting, Lausanne's composition with grey lines. It's a painting that no longer contains any visible representation of the outside, customary world of the senses. Rather, it has become a fully abstract work, in which the painterly tools of line and composition have become the primary characteristics. However, this composition has a closer connection to Mill by Sunlight, that we just saw, than it may appear on the first glance. It requires, indeed, another way of looking. Despite its appearance, composition with grey lines is still very much inspired by a natural phenomenon. As Mondrian wrote in a letter to his friend and de Stijl colleague Theo van Doesburg, it was a reconstruction, according to the spirit, of a star-filled sky. The construction of the composition is remarkably elementary. 7 horizontal lines and 7 vertical lines are placed at even distance from each other. Then diagonal lines connect the corners of each resulting square. These diagonals are, however, not drawn or painted in one straight line, but connect the corners of the squares one by one. The resulting lines are thus not completely straight and vary considerably in width and intensity of black. As a next step, Mondrian began to fill in the resulting small triangles, which also have various sizes and forms. Just as the lines vary in grey and black tones, the small triangles vary in tones of white, beige, and light grey. The result is visually astonishing. This seemingly static raster turns out to be an intricate interplay of lines and shades. Especially at the points where the diagonals, horizontals, and verticals meet, your eyes seem to notice a flickering movement. If the viewer then wants to focus on the intersection of this movement, the flickering swiftly moves elsewhere in the composition. And I'm not sure how well it works on the screen, but believe me, it really is like that when you see the painting up close. The effect of shimmering makes composition in grey lines a direct successor to Mill by Sunlight. In this entirely abstract painting, Mondrian just as well found a way of conveying a visual experience of radiation. The embodiment of movement in the pictorial surface makes the composition simultaneously endlessly deep and undeniably flat. As art historian Hans Janssen observed, this is a similar experience to looking at a starry sky at night. From Earth, the sky appears to be flat and repetitive, while it is at the same time endlessly far away and impossible to grasp. Already in 1909, Mondrian described to a journalist how he would convey a dance evening on a canvas. In an article of 10 years later, the journalist recalls his answer. He said, "Well, I abstract her in vertical and horizontal lines." He approached dance evenings in the same manner that he approached landscapes, with the aim to uncover their fundamental structures. In conjunction to his experiments with painterly instruments and visual language, Mondrian kept notebooks and began to express the desire to publish theoretical texts in the second decade of the 20th century. He had fellow artists read and provide feedback on his texts and intended them to become accessible to a wider audience. Yet more than once, his attempts at publishing failed. The first extensive text was titled Neoplasticism in Pictorial Art, written between late 1914 and 1918. Originally intended to be published as one book, Mondrian eventually accepted the offer by Theo van Doesburg to have the text published in installments in the new modern art magazine, De Stijl. This magazine was launched with van Doesburg as editor-in-chief in November 1917 as a platform for avant-garde artists. Not only painters, but also like-minded architects, sculptors, designers, and artists in other disciplines were invited to join. The style was to become synonymous with a breakdown of the traditional hierarchy in artistic disciplines. Already around the time that Mondrian painted Mill by Sunlight, he was incredibly interested in the latest philosophical trends. He described the impact of philosophical knowledge, which he saw as an early stage of the road to spiritual knowledge on artistic practices. He wrote, I quote, "There is an important relationship between philosophy and art, and it is exactly this relationship which most painters deny. The great masters grasp it unconsciously, but I believe that a painter's conscious spiritual knowledge will have a much greater influence upon his art, and that it is merely a weakness in him or a lack of genius should this spiritual knowledge be harmful to his art." Unquote. And it's quite interesting how implicitly Mondrian calls himself a genius in writing this. With the 1917 publication of the text Neoplasticism in Pictorial Art, Mondrian introduced the term with which he characterized his abstract visual language. The later translation of neoplasticism originated as in the Dutch term nieuwe beelding. The term beelding did not and still does not exist in the Dutch language. Mondrian seems to have borrowed the term from the writings of a philosopher and theologian, Mathieu Schoenmakers, who used it in relation to a wildly speculative theory of metaphysical mathematics. The word is derived from terms such as afbeelding, and meaning representation, and verbeelding, meaning imagination. As these two terms are used in reference to established art traditions, Mondrian felt that he had to come up with a new word to characterize the radically new turn that he wanted his art to present, an art that was independent of all that had happened before. The term building reflects this desire of independence of representation and imagination, towards an art that functioned and existed independently of figurative traditions. Not directly referencing anything visible in the outside world, Mondrian's art was to embody the relationships of which that world essentially existed, not visible for the eye, but structurally present behind visible reality. In his thinking, Mondrian consistently sought the balance between opposites: visible, invisible, natural, spiritual, objective, subjective, universal, particular, abstract, real. Mondrian acknowledged that his paintings could not establish a fully spiritually elevated state on their own, yet the artworks could function as precursors to his envisioned abstract way of engaging with the visible world. For Mondrian, abstraction did not only concern art, but just as much life in its entirety. To emphasize this view of the world, he coined a new word, ziening. This is the visionary equivalent of building, which could be loosely translated as something like visioning. To Mondrian, there were different gradations of ziening, but ultimately, if one was capable of objective ziening, it meant one was able to view the world in the way that Mondrian expressed it in his art. He maintains this idea throughout his life, with the telling title of a 1942 text, Towards the True Vision of Reality. Mondrian saw his new pictorial instruments, the fully abstract language, as witness to a new ziening. His art is no longer about what it represents, but about the harmony and balance achieved by means of pictorial instruments. Many art historians primarily focus on the notion of building, with the aim to grasp the artistic significance of Mondrian's abstraction. However, if we are to better understand the elementary role of spirituality in his artistic practices, I think the notion of ziening is essential. In his linguistic inventiveness, Mondrian even combined the two notions into the term of beeldend zien. This embeds the pictorial instruments of line and color in the spiritual mode of viewing. I would argue that this beeldend zien is not only a theory of art, but needs to be understood as a worldview, as a spiritual engagement with the world, as well as with existential questions about the future of that world. In 1919, Mondrian wrote, I quote, "The pure beeldend zien has to build a new society, like in the arts it has built a new plastic. A society of equal dualities between the material and the spiritual, a society of balanced relationships." Unquote. For Mondrian, his new art was intrinsically rooted in a vision of a new world. Mondrian advocated spirituality through vision, which he encouraged in people by having them look at his paintings. Yet his spiritual claims were often conceived of as rigid, strict, and dogmatic. This dogmatic perception was more linked to Mondrian's use of limited visual elements, horizontals, verticals, primary colors, rather than to the content of the spiritual claims. For many, the unchanging, traditional, timeless universality that Mondrian claimed to convey went over their heads. Essentially, in order to move forward in creating a new art for a new future, Mondrian attempted to look back as far as he could. This is a tendency that can be recognized in various modern art movements, from the pre-Raphaelites in Britain to the French Surrealists. While the latter looked to the uninhibited and seemingly untrained pictorial language of medieval and outsider artists, the former carried their idols of the past in the very name of their movement. For Mondrian, the engagement with the past concerned the notion of vision and the values attributed to vision. To understand the dual nature of past and present, of timelessness and modernity, it is valuable to look at the changing nature of vision from pre-modern to modern settings. As argued by historian Jonathan Crary, a dramatic shift took place in the early 19th century, grounded in the change of optical devices. Crary sees the camera obscura as paradigmatic of the dominant status of the observer in the 17th and 18th centuries, while in the 19th century, the stereoscope becomes of primary importance. The crucial implications of these devices for the status of the observer are that the camera obscura was thought to establish an objective perception, reliable and truthful. Yet with the introduction of new optical instruments, like the stereoscope, vision became increasingly tied to the body. A more embodied experience of vision was increasingly perceived as individual, subjective, flawed, and unreliable. In Crary's analysis, there is a very clear development from one phase to the next. Yet I propose that Mondrian's ideas about vision can only be understood if these two phases are regarded as intertwined. Mondrian's visual language of abstraction was undeniably innovative, radical, and modern. It is the type of visual language to which individuals can relate in a very personal and a very subjective manner. Yet what he wanted to express with his pictorial language was of timeless, unchanging, and objective nature. As generations of artists had done before him in finding modes of expression for religious principles, Mondrian attempted to grasp an underlying, invisible essence that he discussed in terms of the spiritual. He regarded organized religion, its imagery and symbolism, as institutional forms for conveying this underlying spiritual essence. With his art, he offered an alternative form, one that was suitable for the world of his time, and that of the future as he envisioned it. Thanks to the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Park Postdoctoral Award, I have been able to conduct research to work towards demonstrating Mondrian's paradoxical endeavor of combining pre-modern and modern modes of seeing in the encouragement of spiritual visions with his viewers. The painter seemed to be fully aware of this discrepancy, but nevertheless pursued it throughout his artistic career. This discrepancy turned out to be a persistent feature in the public reception of his art. Many critics were not prepared to take up the challenge to move beyond the surface in their own vision, and remained at the level of literally interpreting the pictorial language of the paintings. This challenge still has a large presence in research and exhibition practices today. In response, my proposed shift in focus from Mondrian's abstract visual language, from building, to its visionary equivalent of seeing, could serve as a crucial step in the perception of the artworks as embodiments of Mondrian's worldview. In applying for the postdoctoral award, the following statement on the website drew my attention. Art provides a means to experience the sacred beyond prescriptive narrative, as Jeffrey Rubinoff wrote. And I think, as I wrote in the application letter as well, this is something that strongly relates to how Mondrian approached his art. And that's why I think this makes it such a suitable occasion for me to present my work to you here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lieke, very much. That was wonderful. Let's have a few questions. First of all, any of the students want to ask any questions or make any observations? Yes.
Thank you. That's so enjoyable. I'm not my area is medieval, and so one of the things that I'm particularly interested is the ways in which you explore how he integrates pre-modern and modern. The question I have is really related to the impact of the First World War, which in general shattered beliefs in institutions as a way of leading to harmony in humankind. And the real question then is, to what extent does his search for a non-institutionalized system really reflect the experience? Plus, of course, Holland was neutral in the First World War. So in one sense, I'm not familiar with his writing, so I don't know how he responded to the First World War, but maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, thanks. During the First World War, Mondrian moved from the Netherlands to Paris in 1912, and he used to visit the summers. He used to visit the Netherlands, and a week after he went to the Netherlands for a visit in the summer of 1914. The First World War broke out, so he stayed in the Netherlands, quite forced, because he could not go back to Paris, and that actually really helped him develop the inspiration that he found in Cubism during these first couple of years in Paris. He developed that further during his sort of forced stay in the Netherlands with these colleagues with which he founded the style art movement. So I think for Mondrian himself, it was actually a really fruitful period to be in the Netherlands during the First World War. There is, I think it's a letter or a diary from a friend with which he spent some time in Zeeland, which is the most southern province of the Netherlands, so close to Belgium, and where a lot of Belgian refugees would come from fleeing Belgium. And she writes in a letter or in a diary, she writes something like, Piet is completely undisturbed by the explosions that we hear or the masses of people fleeing to Zeeland. And he's only, focused on the motive of the dunes, the sea, and the church in finding an abstract way of drawing it, something like that. So he's really sort of, he doesn't, his sort of artistic endeavors are not necessarily directly impacted by what happens in the First World War. Interestingly enough, during his lifetime, so more towards the Second World War, he gets, also in his writings, he gets really politically engaged, and he really sort of rejects all institutional forms of politics, of ideology, of religion. And I think around 1936, he wrote a text called A New Religion, ? And he says something, well, the new religion is faith in life. And he says, well, institutional religion, so traditional religion, and the new religions of communism and Nazism, they need to be all rejected, and he's really strong about that in his text, and also in writing correspondences with friends. And then more he starts to relate his art to what's going on in the world. So not necessarily already during the First World War, but more towards the Second World War. Yeah. And well, one last thing that's interesting, I think, is when Mondrian moves back to Paris in 1919. So after he really reached that iconic style of primary colors and the horizontals and verticals. He moves back to Paris, and he's very disappointed with that artists in Paris have sort of returned to figurative artworks. So Picasso was one of his heroes, you know, for the Cubists, the invention of Cubism, and then yeah, of course, Picasso after the First World War returns to more classic figurative style again, and Mondrian is very disappointed by that, and he's like, well, this is the place where it's all happening and it all should be happening, and now you're giving up, you know, the war is won, and now you're sort of, yeah, you're defeated by your return to figurative art again. So that's quite interesting. Thanks.
I think, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Thank you, first of all, for such a nice presentation. I have a question about, you talked about the interplay of universal and particular. So I'm just wondering, you talk about the balance in objectivity and subjectivity, and you relate it with the spirituality and the sacred. So I'm wondering, in his work, can we make a distinction between the sacred and the profane? Or can we just make a strict distinction between the spirituality and the religiosity? And how he would define spirituality as a universal truth, as you already spoke in your presentation, but I would like you to extend more on it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting point. In how Mondrian uses the terms religion and the spiritual, in the beginning he uses them, well, actually throughout all of his writings he uses them sort of intertwined. So, but very strongly, I think he says when he uses the term religion, he means institutional, traditional religions, Christianity, Judaism, and the spiritual is for him sort of the way forward. So in one of the texts, I think from 1919, he says something, well, it's a dialogue, it's a much used form, I think, around that time, that you have someone who asks the questions, and then you as the person responding to these questions, you can share all your insights without lecturing as an artist, kind of in the text. So there is a novice asking sort of silly questions, and he as an artist responds to that in the text. And the novice asks something like, so how about medieval iconic artworks, aren't they spiritual at all? And then he says, well, they are spiritual in the sense, in the sort of in the way the composition is set up and the pictorial elements are distributed in the picture plane, but the symbols that they express, or the imagery or the symbolism they express is traditional, and it's sort of, that's expressing a traditional religious institution, while if you want to know through spirituality, it's about the balance in the pictorial elements and the use of color. And so he sort of wants to overcome that sort of what you see on the surface, like he also wants in his own artworks. But yeah, he does use the term religiosity later on in writings as well, when he wants to pinpoint the sort of the spirituality that he advocates. He also uses the term God a lot, or the divine. So it's I think to understand what he means, we have to go beyond the use of the term, or the presence of the terms, and we have to see how he uses them in each context anew, I think. Your question about the distinction between the sacred and the profane is a really interesting one. I think I think also with what we will hear about from the other speakers, Mondrian was an exponent of the sort of the generation of modern artists who really wanted to radically or envisioned a radically new world. In which also the art played a fundamental role. So for Mondrian and for his colleagues of the style, it was the sort of the ideal that the whole world would become art. So that the notion of art was to be redundant, because everything was art. And it was all designed and built up of these, well, elementary structures, and very concretely the architecture of the houses and the streets that they stood in, and then the cities that it was all in balance and harmony with one another. So in that sense, the ideal was that the sort of entire living environment would sort of radiate this a level of spirituality, or have a character of spirituality. So in that sense, in their ideal, there's not really anything profane anymore. But obviously, what I also said in the presentation is that he was very much aware that his contemporaries were not at all prepared. Even some of his fellow artists, they were like, well, his art is interesting, but the theory is too much. So I think he very much acknowledged that he was battling against, well, what you could call profane elements or interpretations. Yeah.
David.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really finding your description of ways of seeing, how Mondrian introduces these ideas of ways of seeing, as insightful, when frequently we're inundated with theory that deals with ways of representing. I think of the abstract expressionists and all of the discussion of how things should be represented. And I can't help but feel that in some ways, you're suggesting Mondrian was championing different ways of seeing rather than necessarily different ways of representing. And so, like Ambreen, I was wondering if you could articulate your understanding of maybe his distinction between ways of seeing and representing, but more particularly in the context of our own conversation. One critic describes the first of the paintings you presented as a mill dripping in blood and a sky of Swiss cheese. And we all thought it was kind of funny. And I looked at it and I said, yeah, I can kind of see that. And so my question is, what would your opinion be in terms of Mondrian's mandate or his agenda of ways of seeing? How did he respond to that? I mean, did he allow for that way of seeing, or was there only one way of seeing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, I like that quote because it immediately demonstrates the difference between how he intended that painting and how it was perceived by sort of the larger world, and it draws the attention to how you look at a painting. So the critic is indeed really looking at the surface and literally sort of trying to describe what he sees, while Mondrian is beyond that. So I think that's why the quote is, well, it's funny, but it's also a relevant sort of witness to that time, I think. So while his abstract language is often, and his theories as well, I mean, the texts they were published, but they were, for the contemporaries, they were really hard to grasp. He writes really dense and he uses new words to say the same thing over and over again, but makes it more complex as such. So the texts were not really, he initiated them to sort of not explain, but sort of to support his art, because the responses to the art were so, misunderstanding. So he wanted the text to clarify and to support the art, but that didn't help at all. It may have made it more complex for a lot of people as such. And I think in the beginning he is quite sort of frustrated about that people don't get what he wants to say or demonstrate in his paintings. But throughout his life he becomes a bit more tolerant, and he finds a way of incorporating that in his theories, because he increasingly starts to say, well, the art that I'm making is for a future generation, and future people will understand what I want to express. So, yeah, with the quote that I said, that he saw himself kind of as a genius, or maybe even a prophet of times to come. But he also says, in his text of the 30s, he starts saying, well, it's okay if people don't get it. And even if they look at the paintings now and don't fully get what I want to say, it still has the potential to unlock or unleash some kind of the divine in them. So he wants to address their intuition, as he calls it. And even if people don't get it, they need to be confronted in order to develop that intuition further. And yeah, if he wouldn't do that, or his colleagues who paint in an abstract way wouldn't do that, then how will the future people be able to do that later on? So he's still towards the end of his life. He still complains about people not understanding it, but he's okay with that, I think, at some point. Yeah, and definitely it doesn't prohibit him from making the works of art.
Okay, we've got one more question over there, and then we can open questions to everyone in the room, obviously. So please, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm interested in carrying on this discussion of the earlier painting, Mille by Sunlight, especially considering his use of representation with his attempts to intertwine two types of vision, specifically this criticism of that painting, whether he could, I guess, embody the objective view and the subjective view without it being clouded with like an improper representation of a mill. Mm-hmm. You know, because he moved away from that, whether abstraction allowed him to intertwine the two properly or successfully, whether any of his representation stuff did entwine that stuff successfully, or if that was just like a stepping stone for his layer stuff.
Yeah, I think around the time that he paints the mill, so 1908, 1909, that's also the time that he begins writing. And I think these two are very interrelated in also for himself to sort of make sense of what he's painting. So the paintings always come first, but then in trying to find words to describe it, I think that's sort of how he gets at that idea of painting something universal, something timeless and unchanging. But yeah, the way he presents it later on is really that the figurative development from, well, his initial landscapes are quite traditional, and then they become more colorful, and then there's cubism. So and that's really about finding a style for what he wants to convey. So the notion of the universal truth was there, but it needed a style to properly convey it. And for Mondrian, that turned out to be this as very strict abstraction. But you don't start painting abstract out of the blue. There needs to be a reason to come to that, especially in the first decade of the 20th century, when not a lot of people were doing that, let alone appreciate that. So it's I think the figurative works are really have a strong position in that sort of search for a style that allowed him to convey this universal, timeless truth. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm curious whether he was able to successfully convey the timeless truth or the intertwining of vision in the representational, or if that was just like, as you say, like it helped him develop that in his abstraction.
I think so, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think the latter one. Yeah.
I think we have a question from Karun coming up. Can I ask you a very simple question first of all? Well, maybe it's not that simple, but what was his did he have a religious upbringing, Mondrian?
Oh, yes. He grew up in quite a strict Calvinist family. His father was a school teacher for a what you call in Dutch a special education school. So it's religious education, Protestant education, and his father was also very active for the political party from Reverend Abraham Kuyper, which was called the Anti-Revolutionary Party. So very, he had quite a strict upbringing. And also when he left home to go to art school in Amsterdam, the first couple of years he had room and board with a family that had a strictly reformed publishing house or something. So it really was all around him. Yeah.
Karun, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the gray lines picture. I had to see it more closely. Yeah, and as well the previous one was wonderful as well. I just wanted to make sure that I understand the idea of the objective. What I think I'm seeing is how I see. I think I'm seeing how I see, and I'm wondering if what he is trying to get at with this pre-modern approach is this sense that we are all human beings and that we have sort of we share our humanity, and that what you're depicting in the painting is actually a part of ourselves, and that's made concrete and made visible through this sort of experience where you remove distracting elements, and what you're really just seeing is this shimmering, and you're kind of seeing the effect. So I wanted to kind of confirm that, because you could also say that that's very subjective, and from a different perspective it could be like, well, you might see Swiss cheese and somebody might just see a grid, and so I wanted to confirm that he thought that there was some kind of universal perception, and that the art, that was the role of the artist. And okay, and that if I understand correctly, that that he felt like spirituality was something that art could provide a gateway to, or a doorway to, but that it really wasn't necessarily the stuff of art. That art was not necessarily the sacred itself, but it was a way for humans to approach that kind of consciousness, so that the consciousness itself was the actual goal. I have just sort of a philosophical question, because I think this is, now that I think I understand and I really loved your presentation, by the way. I thought it was very concise and wonderfully done. The question that I have, and the problem that I have with the approach to individualized spirituality, and maybe Alan can talk to this with his anarchist perspective, So once you dissolve the institution that leads people to spirituality, you really expose the individual to a whole lot of, if they're a thinking person, a whole lot of work, if they want to take on that work, and a whole lot of angst if they don't want to take on that work. And so that's for the thinking person, the person that needs to rationalize their existence, and the person who doesn't need to rationalize their existence. You've sort of left them exposed to things like fascism and communism and populism. And so I wonder, I love the idea of individualized spirituality, or at least freedom, the way that artists kind of take this on and wrest it away from institutions. But I wonder whether the argument and the dissatisfaction perhaps with going back to figuration and going back to some of these institutionalized art forms is itself a drive to try to somehow institutionalize this other pathway. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's just a different kind of, seeing a different way, seeing a different kind of an institution. But I wonder if he ever thought about that, of himself as part of an art movement, institutionalized spirituality, or if he had that consciousness at all.
Yeah, thanks. To start with the last point, he very strongly had that feeling, I think. He was, from 1917 onwards, involved in the art movement, the style. And even though he was not, Theo van Doesburg really was the driving motor behind that art movement, but people automatically connected it to Mondrian as well. And he sort of was seen as one of the founding fathers of that art movement. But because it was so strongly connected to Theo van Doesburg as an individual and to, what he thought would be a good move, that's where the magazine at least would go to. And he's tried to set up a course at the Bauhaus, and he started to sort of, do individual PR for the style himself. So I think Mondrian, independently of the style, also tried to find other ways of sort of institutionalizing his approach to abstraction. In his writings, I don't exactly remember the date. I think in the 30s, he started writing a sort of a manual or a syllabus for neoplastic art and for an art school. It never got anywhere, but so he was thinking about that in that sense, that he did want to pass something on to a next generation. That was in 1932, I think, 1933. He tried to join the Freemasons in Paris because he was really conscious about leaving behind his legacy in a broader framework. It didn't necessarily happen in the museum world or in the gallery world. So he and definitely not in the theosophical movement world, because they didn't really like what Mondrian was doing. So he tried to join the Freemasons in order to find a new network where he could sort of leave his legacy, but they didn't accept his application, so that failed. I think he attempted to connect to existing groups, but at some point decided that they weren't ready for him, or they saw things differently. He left it at that. When he went to New York in 1940, he was really sort of hailed as the European hero. And there were a lot of younger artists interested and wanting to connect with him. So I think at that point he sort of realized, okay, maybe that network is already there, or that framework, without him trying too hard himself. I think that's what I can say about that. What you said about art, and whether the artwork itself has a sacred character, or whether it's a sort of a gateway or a channel. really literally writes about that of course an artist, especially a painter, is someone who's working with material means, trying to convey something very immaterial. And that's also why he calls this abstraction, he calls it abstract real art. So it's sort of in between the world of spiritual abstraction and the real natural world. So yeah, he positions himself and his art sort of in the middle as a bit more spiritually elevated than the world around him, but definitely not at that highly elevated spiritual level, because he's working with materiality. But also, if he would be there, he would be a purely spiritual person, as he writes, and not, no longer care about materiality at all. So I think he very consciously chose painting as his medium and stuck to that as well. So yeah, he's never made any music or performances, or there are more immaterial ways of going about that, but he really stuck to painting as his métier.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. So Nikki and then Alan, and then we'll take 3 questions. Why not? Could everyone please use the microphones when they ask their questions, because these words will be transcribed.
Sort of following on from that, I was wondering whether or not he was interested in ideas of the fourth dimension and Ouspensky and Hinton, because I didn't realize until today all the parallels between his theory of abstraction and Malevich's. And that's where Malevich is getting many of these ideas, this sort of idea of cosmic consciousness, this world beyond the world that we know, and trying to access that, and how artists have this very privileged role in doing that. So were those things that he was interested in as well?
I don't think he ever used the term fourth dimension. So I think it's something that's in different places in Europe is really, in that time, is really, people are really engaged with it from different angles, I think. So for him, really the departure point was Blavatsky's secret doctrine. He was interested in the writings of Rudolf Steiner. So it's all there, but I don't think he ever really used the term the fourth dimension itself. He knew Malevich by name, and he knew some of his works. I think he sort of jokingly said something about how can you make a painting white on white, something like that. There's a note somewhere in an interview or in a writing somewhere, but we don't know if he ever saw these works up close or in real. So yeah, that's I think that deserves more research on that connection. Yeah.
Alan?
I wanted to ask you about his response to Cubism, because Cubism combines a valorization of subjectivity and individual subjectivity with a quest for objectivity through, paradoxically a breaking down of the utilitarian vision for the intuitive vision, which is a path into Bergsonian metaphysics. Right, which is a claim to universality in terms of perception and so forth. So, you talked about how he was disappointed with Picasso going back to a realist style in response to the call for a new order or whatever after World War I. But could you tell us more about whether he's in dialogue in a profound sense with the Cubist agenda?
I think primarily he was attracted on a visual level. So I'm not really sure actually if he is really invested in the theoretical agenda behind it. I think on the visual level he recognizes that it provides him pictorial instruments to work with, and that it fits what he intuitively wants to do, but I'm not sure if he is engaged with them on a theoretical level so much.
It's a competing metaphysics, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. I will have to explore that further. Yeah, thanks.
Please. It should be on.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I'll be brief since we're running out of time. But basically, I'm interested in how he was able to reconcile the fact that he wanted to build this new society, in a sense, based on universal truth and be accessible to a wide audience, but eventually sort of resigned himself to the fact that people of his generation wouldn't get it, and that he hoped future generations would. And so, I mean, it seems obvious to a certain extent that has been true because we're sitting here talking about him. But there, I wonder how he would feel about the average museum goer and their experience today, because I think there really is a struggle still to comprehend what he was reaching for. So I guess looking forward, maybe you could comment on the future of how he would perceive the future of his work.
Now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, that's a question actually that I was asked a lot last year when it was 100 years, the centenary of the foundation of the style art movement, which was celebrated widely all over the Netherlands. Partly because the art was put in the spotlight, but also it was a big sort of marketing campaign of drawing in more tourists. One of the things on that in that year was a thing called city dressing, and I don't know if you know that term. I didn't before last year, but it means that in the streets everything is sort of dressed in, well, last year in primary colors and horizontal and vertical lines, and it was a great success because it doesn't really it's not really a commercial how do you say it? It's not really an advertisement because you don't use language, you only use the visual language, and it was put on the City Hall of The Hague, which is designed by Richard Meyer, so it's already a big eye-catcher, but now even more. And slowly but steadily, different cities in the Netherlands started to adopt that program, and there were primary colors everywhere, which was very festive and very nice, but also got a lot of critique. And one of the questions indeed was, so what would Mondrian have thought of this? Working for the museum that sort of instigated that whole campaign, we always said, well, he probably wouldn't think of it as high art, but he also probably would have liked or appreciated the endeavor, because his ideal, after all, was that the whole world would become sort of neoplastic, turned neoplastic. So it's really hard to say, of course, what he would have thought. But I think what is problematic is that, and it really showed last year in the Netherlands at least, that we like or we appreciate the radicality of the primary colors, and that has turned into a brand. It has turned into a visual brand, and it's everywhere if you start looking for it. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon in itself, but we've lost the content. And I think that's problematic. And working in the museum, on several occasions I tried to say, well, should we do something with his spirituality? Because after all, that was quite important. And then they were like, no, we have to present him as a modern man enjoying modern life, because that will draw people in to come here and to then start looking at the art. So there is a long way to win, I think, in that end. Yeah.
There is one more question. I want to make sure you get it in. So if you can, if you can answer it relatively.
Thanks, Lieke. You spoke of Mondrian as trying to create some art, or trying to create art without previous influences. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that he achieved that? And if he did or didn't, what I'm more interested in is what kind of headspace do you think he was in? Can you shed any light on that?
What do you mean with headspace?
How did he, what I visualize is he would have sort of, almost could have meditated, somehow got to some sort of state to sort of, if it's true that you're saying he tried to create art, and it was quite obvious that it's creative original, but he created art without any previous influences, well, he had to create something new or something that he believed in, but I don't know if you have any insight on what his thoughts were maybe, or how he somehow got to that point.
Well, there is a really nice letter from, at that time, a really young Charlie Torop, who is one of the Netherlands' famous painters as well. She's a realist painter. She wrote in 1908 or 1909 that Mondrian would visit during the summers, he would visit the province of Zeeland in the south, where there are a lot of beaches. And she wrote something like, oh yeah, that silly Mondrian in his Buddha posture on the beach is meditating, whatever. I think that is something that it doesn't really return in later on, or that he writes that he's meditating or anything like that. So I think, like a lot of other artists that we will hear about as well, it was fashion to be engaged with these different kinds of alternative spiritualities. And he tried them out, and I think he picked and mixed and matched what fit him. I like to think that writing was for him a way of getting further and getting to that sort of original state, that trying to put his, to create a bridge between the visual and the textual, and sort of try to, get to something, an original place. But he was also very inspired by the world around him. I mean, when he first moved to Paris and he got to know the Cubist art, he would also draw buildings in his street, and he would look at architecture and distill lines from the buildings in his street. So it's not that he needed to completely disconnect from the world around him in order to get there. And I would argue the contrary, actually. So yeah, he would go out dancing, and he would go to the cinema, and he's noted for, or not noted, he's known for his love of Disney films, and because that was new, and it was moving image and synchronous sounds, and yeah, he was fascinated by new things, new jazz music, new dances. So I would like to argue that he, in that connection with, modern new things in the world around him, he got to that place as well.
Lieke, your talk has generated so much interest that the questions keep coming. We just have one from Danielle over there, and if you could keep the question and the answer relatively brief, and then we'll move on to the next session.
I'll start my thought process, but during my time here, Karun and I have been discussing language. During my time here, Karun and I have been discussing language and the best way to describe and use words to describe art. And we've heard of language such as plastic and elastic space and things that Jeffrey has used to describe artwork and other types of music. And on your tours, Karun has played music for you guys, so we've experienced, you get a feeling of when you understand music when you hear it, but we've been struggling with how to kind of get that same feeling across with words. You discussed a number of different kind of language that Mondrian came up with, and that idea of originality came to my mind. So how do you think these words came to mind, and how do you think he thought they would become universal for artwork, or do you think that they were just used to describe his original art?
That's a really good question. I think the words, the language that he found these words in writings of his contemporaries. So the word building really has a source that he got it from a philosopher and theologian that he knew, and he took it out of there and he applied it in a new setting, namely his art. And I think from that he went to that word Zining quite quickly. So I think he did read a lot of philosophers and some theologians as well, and he, like with the spiritual interests, he took things from different sources and used them to his own accord. I do think he used them. In using them, he thought he established a new language that would last a lifetime, if not longer. I do believe that he felt that he really wanted to establish something new in using these words. Yeah.
That was superb, Lieke. Can we give a round of applause to Lieke, please?